All right, that camera doesn't seem to be working again. I do not know what's the matter with it, but. All right, well, Claire, we're going to be talking about the reading, so you don't have to see us anyway, I guess. You see a blank screen there. All right. Now, Miriam, this chapter probably was newer to you than it is to most of us because it's really focusing on early American missions, okay? Just give me your general impression, just thinking about the whole chapter in general, how does it leave you? What impact does this chapter have on you?
There's a lot of information,
Yeah.
but it seemed like it was kind of cool to like see how they like talked about all the missionaries that we've talked about for the most part, and they're like, this person is doing this, and at the same time, this person is doing this, and then it just kind of brought it all together, and like this is everything that was happening. So I don't know. It's kind of cool because we've been talking about one missionary and then another missionary.
Yeah. Do you remember what the 3 missionary movements in early America were?
The Great Awakening.
That was involved in. That really wasn't considered a missionary movement, but it influenced.
Like
Slave
they were
missions.
working towards.
Yes, yeah. Sharon, did you say one?
Slave missions.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of slave missions before? Or is that a new concept? Yeah. And then what were the other 2? Native American missions and
Sandwich Island.
which is?
It was like Hawaii.
Yeah. Hawaii used to be called the Sandwich Islands. I'm not sure why, except there was a Duke of Sandwich who actually, I don't know if you heard that story, that he wanted to come up with a quick lunch, so they invented the sandwich. That's where the name sandwich comes from, the Duke of Sandwich. Anyway, he may have had something to do with the Sandwich Islands.
He was from Hawaii.
No, he wouldn't have been, but the British had their fingers everywhere, right? They're involved in everything. They're all over the world. All right, so, okay, chapter 4. All right, so give me some feedback. What are some things you put on your notes that you thought were interesting?
Are we talking about chapter 3 at all?
I'd like to, but unfortunately, I can't. I wish we could. There is a lot in here. We had 22 pages of reading for this, and it's packed with stuff. So that's why I'm only asking you if you did the reading, and then just make some comments. I don't want to overwhelm you. So give me an observation from the reading. Let's do it this way. The first part talks about, it gives kind of an overview. Just let's say from page 66 to 69, the middle there, up to the missions to American Indians. Was there anything there you underlined, starred, marked?
Just kind of sickening to realize, like, you read the first paragraph, and then you think, like, oh, it's probably the Native Americans, like, scalping people. Or, like, because it says raiders attacked a peaceful village of Christian farmers. And it's like, oh, plot twist. They were actually attacking Christian Native Americans.
And Miriam, I'll say this for your sake. Sometimes we Americans look back at early American history as being, this was a Christian country. Everything was Christian motivated. And this is one of those chapters that reminds you that just isn't quite the way it was. There were some really, really, really unfortunate things that went on. A lot of land grabbing, as we talked about before, and selfishness. Good. What else, Matt? First couple of pages there.
Why is it, do you think people have this assumption that America was founded on like Christian ideas when a lot of the people who founded America were not?
Well, I think it's correct to say that the principles that we founded our country on were Christian principles. You look at our Constitution, you look at, so that's true. We have to make a distinction between Christian principles and then, Christian attitude or the Christian, because, we came from England and Europe, and even in those countries, Christian principles dominated, words like providence and, and things like that. In fact, there was a time, I don't know if this is still true, that somebody studying law actually had to study the law of Moses as part of what they took. They actually take a course in the Mosaic Law in order to help them understand how law works. So, I do agree with the statement that we were founded on Christian principles by and large. It was a Judeo-Christian background, but that doesn't mean that everybody's a part of the system is going to honor that and abide by that. And I think part of the problem too is that when the colonists came in, there was this theological idea among, especially the Puritans, that how did the Puritans view American colonies or the New World in general?
As rebels?
Pardon?
As rebels?
Well, okay, I'm not thinking about the Native Americans. I'm thinking about you mean the people back there looked at the colonists coming as rebels?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I'm thinking about the colonists themselves. When they came over and they started settling colonies, what was their vision for America? How did they see that?
Like the colonization of it, how they wanted to develop.
They did, but why? What was the end game? What did they envision America being?
Paradise, like a Christian nation.
Yeah, think theologically. You're right. They did want to make it into a spiritual paradise, but remember, most of them were reformed in their theology, and so many of them believed that the new world would become the new Israel. Okay, Europe was corrupt. They fled Europe. The Anglican Church, the Catholic Church were corrupt. So they fled the persecution of the Catholic Church and even the Anglican Church and came here. And many believed that America was going to be kind of like the new Israel. And so I think that so they wanted to colonize everybody. They believed they had a right to colonize. And part of the justification was, look, when Moses led the people out of Egypt, what did they do to the Canaanites? In the land of Canaan, what did they do to them?
Pushed them out or killed them.
Yeah, I mean, God commanded them to destroy them. Don't leave a living soul, a breathing soul in Canaan. Like there are people today that would criticize Christianity because, for the fact that God would command them to go in and kill everybody off. Why? Well, God had a right to. God gave that land to his theocratic people, Israel. So there were a lot of people that believed that the same kind of thing would happen here in the New World. We would come in and displace or destroy the pagans who were in this land to establish a new Israel, a Christian nation. So they could actually use the exodus from Egypt and the conquest of Canaan as justification for what they were doing here.
How widely accepted was that idea? Because I've never heard that before, that they thought of it as Israelite.
Yeah, how widely? That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, many of the Puritans believed that this was going to be the church replaced Israel. This was going to be the new, and the Mormons did the same thing. Joseph Smith believed that the church had been corrupt, and so now a new church was going to replace the old one, and it would be here in America. So, but I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't want to exaggerate the numbers and percentages. But that idea was out there.
We talked about that in school, like in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about that they saw it as the Holy Land or Israel, or like that, and so they wanted to destroy with them. So we learned it in school. So I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I bet you Dr. Ken Rathman would probably have a better answer than I can give you on that. He's a historian by trade. But yes, it was out there. So, all right, let's talk then about just one statement I want to point out from the top of 67. Indian missions were the only American missionary activity at the time of the Revolution. So when the colonies were at war with England, there wasn't any other missionary movement in the colonies except for the native. And you remember he says later on that that began to shift. People began to get disillusioned with Native American missions because, well, we read about King Philip's War and all of these disastrous things that happened. And there was a shift now to evangelizing the colonists, the white man. And now, excuse me, the mentality toward the Native Americans wasn't so much to evangelize them now, but to eliminate them. Now, everybody had their own idea of elimination. Some eliminate meant to make, just to wipe them out, kill them off. Others, a little bit less, let's displace them, let's give them, put them on reservations. And so you have all of these Indian removals that took place. The biggest one, being the Cherokee Trail of Tears that they talk about. We showed a picture of that when the Indians had to leave. So that began to happen, and people paid less and less attention to evangelizing Indians, Native Americans, and more attention to missions among white men. Okay, but during the Revolution, it was the Native Americans. All right, so tell me, what did you note from the overview of the early missions to the American Indians? Page 69 and following there. Up to 75. I'll just say again, probably the best way to prepare for this class, you can mark them on your cards, but I've got a bunch of stuff underlined. So if you underline some things, help us spot them.
Seemed like the majority of them still didn't really see them as equal to the white people, I guess, or to the settlers, right? Because they viewed them more as animals or as dumb.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had to colonize them or put them in a boarding school and make them adopt all these not American customs. Was it American then? But adopt all these
Colonial.
white people, customs.
European really was because at this time in history, the colonists still considered themselves European. The idea of being an American would come about later. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just on page 71, sorry, can I change the topic?
No, yeah, sure.
On page 71, it says at the very top, it says but a striking example of egalitarianism in the early days is the first Methodist mission to Indians. It just didn't make sense to me because egalitarianism is usually referring to how people make male and female equal, and then they start talking about changing their missions to Indians. Did they have a different view of what egalitarianism is?
Yeah, you're thinking of it in one context. Egalitarian just means equal. So it's the idea of viewing the Indian as made in the image of God, just like you are, equal before God. In fact, he mentioned a little earlier than that, I think the previous page, that Brainerd had that idea, which we would compliment him for that. He mentioned Brainerd and Jonathan Edwards. The statement on 69 is, the old assumption that civilization must precede evangelization dropped away in the mid-1700s thanks to David Brainerd and Jonathan Edwards. So they developed more of this egalitarian mindset, not in the male-female sense.
It's usually that word is a negative or anti-biblical, so then I was just, I don't know.
Right. But yeah, here it's being used in a different sense. Yep. In my opinion, a proper sense. The Indian's not a savage that's half man and half, whatever. He is made in the image of God, just like the rest of us. Right. Because there were some people that would even view the Americans. I actually had a friend in high school whose dad believed that African Americans were part of the curse of Canaan. We shouldn't even try to win black people to Christ. It was pretty radical because they were part of the cursed line of Canaan. Back when Noah cursed them, pronounced a curse. So that's the idea of egalitarian here that they're using.
That's all.
I think it's appropriate. Yeah. Good. What else?
I just thought it was sad how much the government involvement hurt their ministry and a lot of ministry opportunities they could have had, and just how they tried to change so many things and just meddle with them. Just,
Mhm.
It just messed up a lot.
Did you get the impression when you read this that everybody is really trying to wrestle with what seems to be a no-win situation? If you were involved in Native American missions, there is a certain sense, humanly speaking, when there's no way out. Why? Well, several things. One, you do have political involvement. There were many in government positions that really did want to help the Native Americans. They saw the handwriting on the wall that if they didn't do something to protect them, they would be wiped out. They'd become extinct. In fact, do you remember reading about, me and names just don't get along. He's actually in Tucker's textbook as well. What was his name? He was in a political position, and he did not favor the removal of Indians from their territory, but he saw no other way to avoid extinction. So he compromised in order to save them. That resulted in this mass exodus from Georgia and the South.
Folks said that some people criticized him for that. But as I was reading it, it really seemed like that was the only thing he could do, and he was doing better than some of the other people.
Yeah, if he did nothing, then the colonists would eventually just wipe him out. And so, I mean, there are times in history and even in our lives, you get in a situation that, man, no matter what I do in this situation, something's going to be wrong. What do you do? It's easy to be armchair quarterbacks and to read this stuff later on and be critical, but some of these were really, really trying to help them. And some of them felt, look, if we don't colonialize the Indians, then they will die. The only way so remember, some of them sent their children to American, colonial, locations so that at least they could grow up and not die and they could get an education. And yet, what did it do? It destroyed their families. It ripped them away from their parents, which is a very ungodly principle. See, so they're wrestling with this. Man, on the one hand, we're going to pull them away from their own families, but on the other hand, if we don't, they're all going to die together. What do we do? Harriet Beecher Stowe, you remember reading about her in there? She's, Miriam Harriet Beecher Stowe was a very famous American author during the Civil War. She wrote about that, Which brings me to another point. The Civil War started in 1860, but many, many years, decades before it started, it was already threatening. You read here in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there's already the threat of civil war over the issue of slavery. But that's dealing with Black Americans here. Sorry, we jumped ahead, but I'm just saying, you read this and you think, Lord, what were these Christians supposed to do? How were they supposed to deal with something where it seemed like no matter which decision they made, there was going to be something wrong with it? And so it's tough. We don't have to deal with that particular situation today. All right, anything else that comes out of the Native American part there? Native American missions? All right, let's go on to the next one. Oh, by the way, just to mention, there's one tribe that he said did especially well in receiving the gospel, but they also kind of gave into colonial culture. Do you remember which tribe that was?
The Cherokees.
Yeah, the Cherokees. And interestingly, they're the ones that suffered, probably one of the ones that suffered the most in the removal of the Native American removal, the Cherokees. So even though they tried, he says they played by all the rules. Remember reading that? Let's see if I can find it here. The Cherokees, they actually took the Cherokees' case to the Supreme Court and won it. Here's another fact that's going on. Okay, they go to the Supreme Court. Now today, you guys know the power that the Supreme Court has, right? But in that day, states' rights were still much more important than any federal government. And as you know, one of the big reasons the Civil War actually started was because the South believed that this federal government was getting far too powerful. And it did involve the slave trade, but even more perhaps than the slave trade, at least at the beginning, was this idea of states' rights. And here, they took the case of the Cherokees to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court voted in favor of the Cherokees, that they have a right to their land. And how did the state of Georgia, for example, respond to that? They told the Supreme Court to go fly a kite. Is that a go fly a kite means fooey on you? I'll see how. In other words, they ignored them. The Supreme Court says you can't take the Cherokee land, and they said, go fly a kite. I don't know why we come up with that, but you guys still use that in your generation? Go fly a kite?
Sometimes.
I never know for sure if I'm, get myself in hot water with what I say. And in fact, one of the American presidents, in fact, who was the American president at that time? He said the same thing. You remember who he was? Good old famous Andrew Jackson. You can find him on, is it the $50 bill or the $100 bill? He's on one of those. 50, I think, yeah. Okay, Andrew Jackson, what's he said? Here it is. On the bottom of page 73, the state of Georgia simply ignored the Supreme Court decision. President Jackson refused to carry out the ruling, reportedly saying, John Marshall, who's the Supreme Court Chief Justice, has pronounced his judgment. Let him enforce it if he can. Oh, well, so what does that tell you? It just, at that time, the states' rights were much more powerful than the Supreme Court itself. And so, but if the state, it's very, very complicated. And as we know, it eventually erupted in a civil war, which just about destroyed our country.
The guy you were talking about, I think, was Isaac McCoy.
Yes, thank you. Isaac McCoy. Thank you very much. Really an honorable guy in a lot of ways. But he got caught in the middle of all this, and he had to do something that he felt. He regretted that he did not intend for the Cherokees to suffer like they did when this removal took place. I think he envisioned something a lot more decent, a lot more organized, but it resulted in thousands and thousands of deaths. Very disorganized, very bad. All right, let's move on to the slave missions then on 75 and following. This one is very interesting as well. What are your observations about what went on slavery missions?
I think it was interesting how they had a really good opportunity to share the gospel with them, but then they it says missionaries set aside anti-slavery sentiments for the chance of bringing spiritual salvation to a population. So they had a really good opportunity, but then they kind of just ignored the fact that they were all slaves and that was not a good thing. So they were like, oh, we'll just leave it because we can share the gospel with them in that way. So I think that was really interesting.
Yeah. So if I understand what you're saying, they actually believe that maybe slavery was the best way for slaves to hear the gospel. If we free them, then will they have the same opportunity for us to share the gospel? At least on their plantations, in many cases, they were allowed to have church meetings and things. Some of them were allowed to have meetings and to try to reach them. So they're trying to justify slavery because of it's a pragmatic approach, right? It's not a theological approach. It's pragmatic and it's wrong. That's what Harriet Beecher Stowe was really responding to. Let me see if I can find her statement. Or if one of you has that, there was up the top of one of these pages. Yeah. Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I'm assuming you've all heard of that, saw what you were talking about, Miriam, and she made a public example of Jones, one of the guys that promoted this idea. She said he was a man of the finest feelings for humanity, and for many years, an assiduous labor for the good of the slave, that his case brought one to see painfully how the moral sense of the finest mind may be perverted by constant familiarity with such a system. That's a mouthful. But basically what she's saying is he was so, the whole idea of slavery becomes so pervasive, so, everywhere, that a lot of people just gave up on the possibility this could ever be ended. So let's just make the best of it and do what we can. She was an advocate for getting rid of slavery, while many believers were advocates of just putting up with it, maybe making use of it to reach people for Christ.
It's interesting too, because I think a lot of the problem here, we look back at them and judge them all the time, and it was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But like the whole culture was just so familiar with slavery that it was a normal thing.
Mm-hmm.
It was accepted and it was fine. And I think the issue is more that they didn't realize it was wrong. Like a lot of them, and they were more blinded by it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. That's what Harriet Beecher Stone's kind of like pointing out too, that they're just kind of blinded to it, and they're just like, let's like, save the slaves rather than like ending slavery. I don't know. It's just kind of a good reminder that like even today we're like, well, we're better than them because we don't have that. Whereas there's things we're blinded to now that we do that.
Yeah, I mean, this may sound really strange, and Miriam, this might be new to you. Actually, and you guys can disagree with me if you want to, but my impression is that in general, the South in America had a stronger spiritual foundation than the North. And there are many, many godly people in the North. Many. Okay? But Robert E. Lee was a very godly man. And in fact, many people in the South would argue from Scripture that the Apostle Paul never commanded converted slave masters to free their slaves. What did he command them to do?
To serve their masters.
To treat them.
Yeah, the masters to treat them well, and the slaves to serve
Right.
the masters.
And he never encouraged slaves who became believers to seek to escape. And now we could argue back, well, that was the Roman Empire, that was a different system, but the principle was still the same. What's the average Christian going to do with the slave movement? You can speak up, and stuff, but and so and I'm not promoting slavery, okay? I'm not saying they should have, I definitely am against it, okay? And the kind of slavery here in the U.S. was very different. For one thing, it was racist. In Europe, you could be any race. In the Roman Empire, you could be any conquered people from any race and be a slave. It was not an issue of race, okay? But Paul takes the attitude that we're not going to change this in the empire. We need to learn how to function within it. That's really what a lot of these people were doing from where they sat. And so it is, who writes history? The winners. And you know what? I've heard, there are some arguments coming from people in the South. We get upset when we see people still flying the Confederate flag. I just saw one here in Aiken. I went by a house where the guy was flying the flag, Confederate. Now, I don't promote that idea. I don't think he should do that, okay? I think he's living in the past. But there are people that, really have some strong opinions about that. But don't misunderstand me. I am totally against slavery. What happened was very unfortunate. But these are Christians who are trying to analyze and do the best they can within the context where they were. We need to be careful and we don't just shoot them. Right. Okay. Anything else about the slave trade and missions in the slave trade?
This kind of relates, but I think John already hinted on it. Like, if you're a missionary and you're going like overseas somewhere and there is like slavery, like, you don't think it's like your responsibility at all to like help them, like, I guess not change them, but like obviously their heart like towards the gospel, like political, like system wise. Are you just strictly there to like just evangelize them? Be like, well, like, sorry, that's your system, or like.
Okay, now I would say no, don't try to change the system, because in that case, you're the foreigner. You don't even have a voting right. You're not a citizen. Here we're talking about people who are citizens. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there is, they do have some leverage that you wouldn't have going over as a foreign missionary. You have no right to make political decisions. So I would agree with your first statement that your responsibility there is to help them know how to live for Christ within their circumstances. And if God gives them the opportunity to change them, like happened here, then yeah. It's a whole different story when you're the foreigner.
I was just curious. I don't remember who it was. Like, maybe we talked about some. I thought maybe like that did. I was just curious, but yeah, you answered it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It was really sad.
I read one of the quotes by the Methodist preacher.
Yeah.
So they said that in order to get access to preach to the slaves, because like there was One of the free blacks was a Methodist leader, and he was trying to like start a slave revolt. But then they made a deal, like Miriam said, where they couldn't like talk about how the Bible talks about like how you have freedom in Christ and different things. And then so the Methodist says that they took part in the mission not to civilize them, not to change their social condition, not to exalt them into citizens or freedom, but to save them, sweeten their toils, sanctify their lives, and hollow their deaths.
Yeah.
This is kind of sad.
Yeah. And you remember what happened? Because he started that revolt, he was a preacher, right? And after that, what happened? All the slave owners started closing their doors to guys like that and being suspicious of guys like that. So what he did impacted negatively the cause of missions among the slaves. Because once he did that, all the slave owners are thinking, okay, this guy's coming in to preach to my slaves. Should I really let him in here, or is he going to start a revolt like that other guy did? So that's true anywhere on the field. When you're on the mission field, you always have to ask that question. If I do something that's a little bit radical, how's that going to impact the gospel ministry, around me? So,
Something else that was
yeah, go ahead.
slavery thing. I think it's really good to see how like it said that they could identify with Jesus because he was the suffering servant, yeah. And I think it's like a good it's good to see like how Jesus came and he was a good example and like he suffered and so people can identify with him and that's why they like became believers because they like saw how Jesus was and that he suffered and how they were like slaves and they are suffering and how we can identify with Jesus and like he had the same things we have even though he didn't sin. And so that was like the best way what God could do to like bring Jesus here and like be a man or a human so that he could like live a life how we do without sin. But yeah, I know.
Yeah, that was a really good point. And out of that suffering came a lot of Negro spirituals. You guys are familiar with the Negro spiritual songs, And by the way, the word Negro is legitimate if you're referring to that genre of music, because that is a genre, Negro spirituals. Can you think of a Negro spiritual? Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. A lot of those spirituals actually came out of the Exodus scenario. They viewed themselves eventually coming out, just as the Israelites came out of Egypt from slavery. A lot of their songs were written in anticipation of the day when they would someday be freed. Going across Jordan, a lot of Negro spirituals. It's a legitimate genre of music. And so, yeah, their identification with Christ really fueled that. Good. Anything else about that? On 78, he does say, right in the middle of the page, in sheer numbers, the slave missions far surpassed any other missionary effort in the world.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, you think about how many slaves came to Christ. American Indians, Native Americans, just the opposite. Well, there were some, but not anything to compare to what happened among the African Americans. And you remember reading, he talks about, remember when Liberia was founded by President Monroe. In fact, the capital of Liberia today is Monroeville, named after President James Monroe. And remember the idea of that? They would allow some of the slaves to go back home and be free to establish churches. But when they went back, this is even before the Civil War, okay, they're allowing people to go back. But when they did go back, they weren't accepted by their own people because even when they were sold as slaves, they were looked down on by their own people. It's not this idea that all Liberians are the same and we're going to go back home and reach our friends and neighbors for Christ. They weren't viewed that way. I mean, who sold the Liberian, before it was called Liberians? Liberia, who sold them into slavery? Their own people did. Their people were making money by selling them. So when they went back with the idea that we're going to be able to start a missions movement among our own people. And they were not accepted back then. They were viewed, in fact, some of them, you may remember reading this, some of the Liberians there actually referred to these ex-slaves as white men because they had lived so long in the white culture. And they acted and thought differently. And so even the movement, it was a good idea to form a free country. That's why it was called Liberia, because they were liberated to go back. But it didn't turn out the way that our politicians thought it would. I think their intentions were noble, but these ex-slaves were not viewed as being able to lead, being educated. So that was it. All right, well, the Sandwich Islands mission, we're actually going to talk more about that coming up to that time in history. And so maybe we can wait and make some comments. So yeah, let's not get into the Sandwich Island mission right now. Does anybody else have another comment? You have just a few minutes. Any of this?
I think it's cool to see how like out of something bad or like terrible, God can like do something really good. Like how so many like slaves came to Christ. Like he used something that was not good for them or not nice, but he like used it for good. Like he did with like later the Jewish people, like the Holocaust, and they got their own country now. So like always, there's always something good coming out of like even bad things that happen.
Isn't it amazing how much of church history is a mixture of good and bad ideas, good and bad methods, and yet God somehow uses it to bring about his glory? It's just, there is no such thing as a church or a mission agency or any ministry that has it all together. All of them struggle in some ways, and yet God uses it. And Miriam, what you just said reminds me of the very end of the chapter. About in the middle of that last paragraph, he says, sometimes, as in the case of slave missions, we can see a glimmer of divine purpose in an apparently insoluble dilemma, no solution. And sometimes, as in the case of Hawaiian missions, which seem to be more positive, joyous providences bring with them responsibilities seemingly too big for anyone's shoulders. Missionaries were often their own most searching critics, knowing full well their shortcomings and agonizing over the moral complexities they faced. They labored on in spite of them, setting an example for us today and launching the global mission effort that we have inherited. That's just a good reminder that there are people who constantly bounce around from ministry to ministry because they're looking for the perfect ministry. And there are so many people in this scenario that just stuck with it. They did the best they could. They said, Lord, we know this is not a perfect situation. We're trying to reach people, and this is what we have. And they stuck with it, and God blessed it. He used them. And I could look back on my 30 years of teaching in Brazil and here and pick apart, the Bible college approach to ministry or something about the college there, the college here. There's always something that you can find fault with. But if you're faithful and you trust God and you're not making moral or theological, concessions, you're trying to use the tools that you have available, the resources that are yours, you just have to trust God to do what you can't do. Unexpected. Good. A lot of good stuff there. Thank you very much. So Miriam's going to wait and do her presentation on Wednesday next week instead of Monday. So if you see it on the schedule, just be aware of that. Thank you.
Dr. Mark, yeah, do you use like a late policy when like reading? Do you use like email or like?
Yeah. Just email it and say, well, we'll just deduct a little bit for being late, but it still counts.